I'm not sure I actually have a definition of reconciliation in that sense that I hold on to in every circumstance. I tend to present my understanding of reconciliation by saying what it isn't rather than what it is. So reconciliation isn't about resolving conflict, it's about transforming it. It isn't about eradicating differences, it's about learning to live and inhabit the differences in a more constructive relational way. And I think reconciliation is very contingent, it's very elusive, and it's very much a long-term project. And it's something that is very rare. I think when I hear people claiming that reconciliation has happened, I'm always quite sceptical, because we never quite fully get there this side of the Perusia. And that's why, at one level, my favourite definition of reconciliation is the one that Stanley Hauerwas gives, which is that reconciliation is when our enemy tells us our story in such a way that we're able to say, yes, that is my story. I think being Canon for Reconciliation at Coventry is interesting in terms of what it means to work out reconciliation, and particularly at the time that I came into the team. Because a lot of the work that I did was to rebuild the infrastructure and the capacity of the organisation to see what its strategic direction was. The main reconciliation work is not done by the team at Coventry, it's done through the 160 members of the community of the Cross of Nails who are out there in their communities throughout Europe, in Africa and other parts of the world. And our job here is to resource them, support them, help them think it through. Irish are great storytellers, we're known for it, it's at the heart of our folklore, our tradition. And the sort of structures we need to move towards reconciliation are the capacity to listen to one another's story. It's accepting that, from one perspective, particularly in prolonged historical conflicts, no one community is without sin. And that goes to the heart of the Coventry story of reconciliation. The litany begins with all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And that is where the capacity to tell one's own story in a way that, rather than excludes and is used to exclude the person you've been at enmity with, you then re-narrate your story to include them. And in that way, their pain, which you may have caused, your community may have caused, becomes your pain and vice versa. And reconciliation begins to happen at that point of relationship. For me, it has to be the bringing of the statue of the Choir of Survivors into the ruins, which was presented as a gift of the Frauenkirche in Dresden and of the Frauenkirche Foundation to the Cathedral of Coventry to mark 50 years of the new cathedral. And why was that? Well, the first visit I made about a month after I arrived was to Hamburg, to the board of the German CCN. So I made it my task to visit as many German CCN partners as I could, and I probably got around 80% of them in my time. I went to every board meeting and executive committee meeting twice a year of the German CCN. And the one place that I really reached out to was Dresden and the Frauenkirche, and started investing in a more active relationship, got the bishop engaged in that, which is something that has captured Christopher Cockworth's imagination, which is great. There was absolutely nothing on Coventry Cathedral site that told the German story. And therefore, if my understanding of reconciliation is the capacity to both tell our story in the presence of our enemy and to hear our enemy's story and to enter into each other's story, then there was something quite profound amiss, that there was no telling of the German story. We had the Stalingrad Madonna, which told something of it, which one of my predecessors, Paul Ostreicher, got brought here. But I wanted something that would memorialise the story of our German partners. And therefore, to receive that gift from the Frauenkirche of Choir of Survivors, to put it into the cathedral ruins, At last, we got to the point where we memorialised the suffering of the German people in that statue. And for me, in terms of how I understand reconciliation after war, that was the most special thing of my time here. So the first 2 years we spent a lot of time discussing what should the mission statement of CCM be. And at one level it was already there. Kenyon Wright had given us it, Healing the Wounds of History. Community Cross of Nails was his idea when he was appointed the first international canon in the early 1970s. And the Community Cross of Nails came into being in January 1974, trying to make sense of all these churches and groups that had received the Cross of Nails in the previous 30 years. And the community was created. And it was to heal the wounds of history, the wounds of war, obvious. For him, it was also the wounds between the global north and the global south, economic exploitation of colonialism, and the wounds with the earth. And one of the first ever Christian environmental conferences was run by the Community Cross of Nails in Atlanta, Georgia, back in the mid-1970s. So that one was already there. We added to it learning to live with difference and celebrate diversity, which recognised the fact that the world we were reconciling with, both the global north-south and the war, were no longer 2,000, 3,000 miles away. They were 2 yards away, or their next door neighbours, because the world had not come. And that was true for most places where Community Cross of Nails is. They were living now with more diverse communities. Difference was on their doorstep. So how do we live with that and celebrate that? And then the third thing was building a culture of peace. How do we help people actually be peace builders? I think one of the challenges the cathedral faces, and this is not new, and so this is not rocket science, because I think it goes right back to the new cathedral and to Bill Williams. It goes back to the city. Who owns the reconciliation vision in Coventry? Who is the community that delivers it beyond the professional staff of canons, people like me who come in to be the canon for reconciliation? I think every canon for reconciliation or international canon has struggled with that one. It still remains, I think, a challenge for us. And that's what we need to capture. To see more Anglican parishes, cathedrals, even dioceses around the worldwide communion joining the Community of Cross of Nails would be incredible, and actually would be a gift, not only just to the communion, but actually to the world, because 80% of Anglicans around the world live in situations of conflict and post-conflict situation. If we were to have 100 new Anglican churches around the world join the Community of Cross of Nails, that could be a game changer, both for the life of the cathedral, in touching conflict situations from Burundi to Sri Lanka to Malaysia. It could be a game changer internally to the life of the communion, because it would give more authenticity to the cathedral being at the heart of a network for reconciliation with the divisions in the communion. And I think it would be a game changer for the city, because it really would help the vision spread. The majority of partners in the Community of Cross of Nails are within Europe, and yet where the world conflict is outside of Europe at the moment, and that's where it needs to be. And so I think that is a big challenge. I do think that in that focal moment of the cross, the story that I've talked about is my definition of reconciliation. That is when the full story of the human predicament is unveiled. And the human predicament is our profound alienation from God, from our very selves, from one another, and from the earth. And the cost of that, the injustice of it, the violence of that is revealed to us on the cross. And at that moment, the price of that alienation is absorbed by Christ. I put all my focus on Colossians more than Corinthians, because to me, the Colossians passages are about the uniqueness of Christ and the reconciling of all things in Christ. The fullness of the Godhead bodily dwells in Christ. And that, the full and complete revelation of that is when reconciliation is complete. And that comes and derives its power and purpose from the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. When Jesus says enough, it was enough to creation. It was enough to the nature that we see that ripped itself apart with so much violence. It's saying there's going to come a time when lion and lamb and wolf will be together. There will be no fear in my holy mountain. It's enough in social relations between men and women, between slave and free, between black and white and yellow and brown, between people of all sexual orientation. So it is basically Jesus saying enough to all that alienates us. I think one of the things that the cathedral needs to realise that while it may have occupied a unique position post-1940 and in the post-war world, it is no longer unique, and to a degree has actually been overtaken by many initiatives and many others. And so the cathedral needs to hold itself a little bit more modestly than maybe it has done in the past. And it is a great story, it is a powerful story, it had its time and place, but it's not the only one now. It's not the only powerful story out there. So it needs to ask itself, what can it therefore bring to the game? Because its story is no longer sufficient to carry it. And for me, that has to be about quality. It has to be about raising our game in terms of facilities in which we host people, because I do still think there's a powerful narrative of the building from the ruins to the new cathedral. And it is amazing how people bring all of their conflicts with them when they come on that pilgrimage to this space. People who've now made Coventry their home come and bring their pain and their narrative of their conflicts and their journeys of reconciliation. And they bring them to the ruins and they hold them there. And they begin to make their story part of our story as a city. And this was brought home to me by one of the first things when I came here was going to an exhibition of art by recently arrived refugees. And probably in 7 out of 10 art pieces, the cathedral ruins appeared in it. And we asked people why. They said that's where we went in our worst days when we first arrived. To be able to sit there at lunchtime in a holy place and reflect. Then maybe that's how we can help build peace. And we can make that message go home. And I think we need to create the space for that. The stories that have most affected me have been about how Germany has dealt with its past and its pain. In the Olympics of how to deal with the past, they have the gold medal. The president has to, by constitutional right, make a speech each year about the past and how they continue to deal with it. And 2 stories have deeply touched me from that. One is about right to the Nazi past and presenting the Cross of Nails to the chaplaincy at the Dachau concentration camp. One staying at the convent on the border of the camp overnight for 2 nights, and I was in the guest house of my own for one of them. It was really quite a deeply, deeply profound experience, and scary is too silly a word to use. It was just haunting to be at the edge of that place. And then to hear of a Catholic priest who was in the camp for being a Catholic priest, who got ill-treated and tortured like others, solitary confinement. And when they were liberated, he chose to stay on to be the priest to the SS guards that were kept there in prison. And then when the camp was used to house refugees from Eastern Germany and into what is now Poland, who were coming to the West, he stayed on to be their priest and was the main advocate for the opening of the camp as a place of memorial, which was opposed by the Bavarian government and so on, and took a lot of lobbying and advocacy. I need to be careful about this story because given where I come from, it could seem to be a bit of an anti-Catholic story, but effectively the Bavarian state government put pressure on the Archbishop of Munich to silence him. And he wouldn't be for silencing. So the rumour was spread that he was in the camp not because he was a Catholic priest, but because he was gay. Because Dachau was the big camp where the LGBT community were held. And on the day that Dachau was declared, it would be a memorial site. He went up into a mountain and hung himself. And that just blew me away, that story. I think our capacity to understand the role of religion in conflict has diminished in the western part of the world. Partly because so many policymakers and people who are responding to conflict struggle to have a visceral understanding of how religion impacts in people's lives. That it's not just a hobby, it's not just what you do on a Sunday, it's not just a private belief system, but it is how you view life, it is a worldview. And we forget that not that long ago, the predominant worldview for many people was religious, within which political and economic and other cultural factors of your worldview fitted. Has religion been the cause of conflict? Most of the conflicts I think we can look at, the primary causes have been political, they've been about territory, they've been about resources, they've been about cultural, tribal animosity. But because religion was the lens through which we saw so many of those things, religion then gives a language for the conflicts. And that's why religion gets a bad time. But I do believe that in the core of faith communities, there is the resource for building peace in our world. The sense of accountability within faith communities beyond this life it's not just mumbo jumbo, big man with a beard in the sky. It's actually saying that there is a point of final accountability. That people sometimes push back against religion, says that lets you off the hook. Well, actually, it doesn't. It's quite terrifying to think that beyond the bounds of life and death, there's another place of account where everything will be open and justice will be completed. And you can put it in the way that Martin Luther King did: the arc of the universe bends towards justice. And I believe very strongly that the place of reconciliation, which is represented by the cross, which we talked about earlier, in the cross of nails, is that place where, in the words of John Paul Lederach, truth and mercy embrace, peace and justice kiss one another. The cross brings all of those four things together and creates the space that we call reconciliation. And I think there will come a time when the truth will be unveiled for all to see, that justice will be declared, but that both will be tempered by mercy and by the peace of God overruling all things. And the challenge for us now as a religious community is to live in the light of that, in how we engage with the world of conflict around us, and therefore to be a resource for peace. For the British people, World War II is the defining myth of the modern nation, particularly the Blitz. You just see it in popular culture. We keep going back to it. Partly, as some commentators have observed, the last war was the last good war, when it looked very clear. And there is truth in that. There was a clear moral as well as mortal danger, and a political danger to our liberties. And it needed to be resisted. That narrative around World War II has also blinded the British people to understanding the true nature of what was going on in that war. If our empire had have fallen with us fighting a more open resistance to liberation movements, then we might have been more aware of our sins in relation to colonialism. That the empire fell on the back of a war where we were fighting a good cause against a tyrannical regime, it's somehow covered over the sin. And therefore we've allowed the defeat of Hitler to almost define the war in a European context without seeing it in the global context, which was the collapse of European colonialism. I think at one level, the most pressing need is not to think it's done. So if we take Europe, for example, the danger. You just have to listen to the dialogue around Greece. The Germans should bail us out because they stole all our gold. You just need to listen to the dialogue about majority voting in the European Union. Poland saying, well, if it wasn't for the Germans, we would be the biggest nation in Europe. So all those tensions are never far below the surface. So we, as Europeans, we should not give up on our reconciliation project. And we have a government that's about to lead us into a vote that could take us out of the European Union, which would be tragic. In 1974, there was a service of celebration at Coventry Cathedral for voting to go into the European Economic Community. And then it has to be Islam. And how does Islam itself respond to modernity? And how do we respond to an Islam that is in crisis, that is a meltdown between Sunni and Shia? How do we respond without panicking? Because at the time that I'm giving this response to you, it's probably running at 10,000 to 1 of Muslims who are being killed by Daesh and others as against outsiders. So we've created this fear that it's about our security. No, it isn't. The Muslim world is turning in on itself. But we need to stop panicking. We need to listen to that. We need to realise that the reason why many young people in our own society, second and third generation Muslims who live here, are being attracted to it is the narrative of the humiliation of Islam and the exploitation of the resources of the Levant and the Gulf is one that rings true to them. And that we need to acknowledge that our foreign policy has created a context in which they find it easy to grow. Doesn't in any way justify them, doesn't say it's right, but we need to respond to that. And I think that is the biggest need. How do we deal with religiously motivated violence that is expressing itself in the Islamic world? It threatens to suck us all into a catastrophe.